Hello everyone. Happy Tuesday. We're glad to present you another episode of PaleoPerk seminar. And today we're very excited to have Stephanie Bodin from Senckenberg Research Institute and Natural History Museum, Germany. And today she will talk to us about charcoal identification to reconstruct paleovegetation and past woodland management. For those of you who are new, we'll quickly go over the format of today's seminar. First, we'll have welcome and announcements, which is ongoing, followed by the talk, which will be approximately 30 minutes, and followed by a moderated question and answer session. Do not forget to send your questions via chat to the questions at PaleoPerks host today, who is Rehmat. A bit of housekeeping. PaleoPerks values the participation of all folks interested in the paleo sciences. Please remember to abide by our code of conduct during today's seminar. Please, you shouldn't be able to unmute yourself, but if you do, please mute yourself for the duration of the talk. You can ask your questions by chatting to the questions at PaleoPerks host or by using the raise hand function. Technical issues should also go to questions at PaleoPerks host. We have closed captions built into the Zoom. Use the CC button to show or hide them. PaleoPerks celebrates the work of outstanding ECRs. So please nominate an outstanding early career researcher. The link will be dropped in the chat shortly. We also collect anonymous weekly feedback to understand the demographics and if there's anything that we can improve in our seminar series. So the link will be dropped in the chat shortly. Please do fill the feedback. Uh, Now to introduce our today's speaker, Stéphanie Bodin. She did her bachelor's, master's, and PhD from the University of Montpellier in France. Currently, she is a postdoc in the Senckenberg Research Institute and Natural History Museum in Germany. Stephanie, please take over.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. So I will share my screen now. Yeah. Here it is. So I hope everyone can see it. Is that okay? Okay. So I'm Stephanie, and thank you very much for joining. So I will talk about charcoal identification today and how it's used to reconstruct paleovegetation and past woodland management. So charcoal identification, it's known as anthracology. So the principle is that we use the anatomy of wood to identify taxa. So the wood has an anatomy, and you can see different images of this anatomy when you look at 3 different sections of wood. And because this anatomy is preserved, even after carbonization, you can still see this anatomy in wood charcoal. And by combining these 3 pictures of wood anatomy, you can identify to which tree or bush it comes from. So, for example, there are differences between taxa. So, depending on the families, some families have a very homogeneous wood anatomy. Sometimes families have a very different wood anatomy. And so, for example, here you can see a difference, without being an expert in wood anatomy, a difference between this Proteaceae and Olea, so the olive tree. And so when you have a charcoal assemblage and when you identify this charcoal, you will check, of course, the dominant taxa that you have in your assemblage, but also the rare taxa, because these rare taxa can be indicator species. For example, you can have only a few taxa, but that are indicator of fire, such as the Proteaceae. They are promoted by fire. You can have also taxa that grows along the rivers, and you will also check the ecology, the place in the succession of the taxa you have identified. And thanks to all these hints, you will be able to reconstruct paleovegetation. So, for example, you will be able to say, do I have a savanna or do I have a forest? You can also use charcoal identification to reconstruct past wood management. So here you will focus on dominant taxa rather than rare ones, because this dominant taxa can reflect the wood that has been preferred, selected intentionally by past people. For example, if in an assemblage from Ethiopia, and I will talk about Ethiopia just afterwards, I had almost 30% of this species, Syzygium, and it's known in Ethiopia nowadays to have good food properties. It's used as firewood to produce charcoal, and also the fruits are edible and they are sold on the markets. So you can also gather information about the uses through this dominant taxa. It can be very interesting to know if they are still known as good firewood and if they provide fruits, for example. You can also have an idea about the harvesting strategy. So for example, looking at the wood caliber, so at the charcoal caliber. For example, on this picture, it comes from a twig, because you can see that the rays, they are not parallel, but they are a bit, how to say, they tend to converge towards the same direction. So it's a small caliber wood. And so it says also that past people were rather collecting twigs, small branches, and not cutting big trunks to have wood. So all of that, it gives information about wood resource management. And I will give you now examples from the tropics and the subtropics about this past wood management and paleo-environmental reconstruction. So I will start with a case in Ethiopia, then we will go to French Guiana, and then to Martinique, which is a small island in the Caribbean. So let's start with Ethiopia. So during my postdoc, I was studying a rock shelter. So it's an archaeological site that is located in the Southwest Highlands. So here. So this rock shelter is at a high altitude, 1,900 meters above sea level. And now it's supposed to be in the forest. We talk about potential vegetation in Ethiopia because now the natural vegetation is highly degraded, but at this altitude for the climate, we are supposed to have a forest. And it's important for what I will say next. So this rock shelter was occupied several times, at least since 21,000 years. And one of the questions we had was, did the vegetation changed during this successive human occupation, and how? So here I will focus on 4 periods. So there are 2 periods where the human occupation was more important according to the archaeological record. So here and here, because there were a lot of lithics found by the archaeologists. Then we have a period where no human occupation was found because there was no lithics, no archaeological artifacts, but it was a period of volcanic eruption. And then in the most recent times, there was a bit of human occupation, but it was much less important regarding the archaeological artifacts found on the site. So how was the vegetation? How did it change? So if we focus on the 2 periods with a more important human occupation, we found in the charcoal assemblage taxa that represent an ecotone, because so on one hand, we had a good proportion of Proteaceae. So remember, it's this family of plants that are promoted by fire. So they are promoted by fire, and they also grow in Ethiopia in savanna-like vegetation type. So they were quite important regarding the percentage, and so they indicate savanna. And we also looked at the rare taxa, as I said before, because, for example, we had 3 different Combretum types, Combretum species. They were only representing less than 10%, but the fact that we had Combretum, even if it's in small percentages, is very important because it indicates also a savanna, because Combretum in Ethiopia doesn't grow in the forest, and they are also fire promoted. And on the other hand, we had also a typical forest taxa. So we had Prunus africana, for example, and the olive tree, which grows in the forest in the highlands of Ethiopia. So combining these informations about these different taxa, we could reconstruct the fact that we had an ecotone around the rock shelter while it was supposed to be surrounded by the forest, even their times. And the other thing interesting that we found is that there was a strong wood selection because 3 taxa were highly represented in the charcoal record. We had up to 50% of the caesium I talked about just before, up to 25% of the Proteaceae, and up to 20% of Acacia. And these species, especially caesium and Acacia, nowadays in Ethiopia, they are still used as firewood because they have good fuel properties. So we can assume that the people, past people, they had this knowledge too, and they were collecting these species because of their good food properties as well. Now, if we look at the charcoal we found during the volcanic period, so where there was supposedly no human occupation, we actually found the same dominance of the same 3 taxa. And so we were wondering, okay, how can that be that the same 3 taxa are dominating the charcoal assemblage where people were not supposed to be there? And also the charcoal were also big, and that's a sign of anthropogenic fire, because big charcoals cannot be transported over long distances. So even in the case of volcanic eruption, it was another hint to propose that the charcoal found in the rock shelter during this volcanic period were also from anthropogenic fire. So it gave us some highlights about things that we can infer that are not seen within the archaeological record. And then when we look at the most recent phase, so when the human occupation was less intense, according to the archaeological record, we found more forest taxa in the charcoal record that are very typical of the forest, like the Sapotaceae and Olea. Caesium grows everywhere. But the fact that we have a dominance of this forest taxa, and then, for example, Chondroitum disappeared from the charcoal record, and also that we had not as much Proteaceae than before, we suggested that it means that the forest was recovering. And so the people were not selecting the same wood taxa because they were not as much abundant in the environment. So to sum up for this Ethiopian example, so we've seen that with anthropology, we can define that there was a landscape opening. There was an ecotone around the rock shelter, an ecotone, so between savanna and forest, and that it was this opening was man-made through fire. So people were using fire, and it has also been seen in phytoliths. So we also look at other proxies. That's really important. And we've shown that actually people might have been in the rock shelter during these volcanic events. So maybe not using the rock shelter for the same purpose as the former phase or the later one, because there were no lithics found. So maybe they were just passing by at the rock shelter, maybe during hunting seasons, or we don't know, but probably the use of the rock shelter was not the same. And finally, when human occupation was less important, we can see it in the charcoal record because the forest is recovering. So now I will give you the second example. So it's about French Guiana. So French Guiana, it's a department northern of South America here. And so I did my PhD on this subject. So this is part of my PhD results. So you have to know that in French Guiana, 98% of the territory is covered by tropical forest. And so far, there were mainly archaeological research on the coast. And on the coast, we know that people were there since at least 7,000 years. But in the forest, we have evidence only since 2,000 years. And we found in the forest that there is evidence of human impact and occupation in the soils. There are a lot of potsherds, there are a lot of charcoals in the soils, and there are anthrosols. So the anthrosols is anthropogenic soils. For example, maybe you have heard about terra preta in Brazil. So it's very black earth, while in the tropic, the earth is rather orange, red. And in French Guiana, we have something a bit in between, but it's still anthrosol, so it's something more like dark brown. It's not as black as in Brazil, but they are still anthrosols. They are also enriched in phosphorus or other nutrients. So you can see the human presence, let's say, in the soil and also in the flora. So in the forest, botanists can recognize indicator species, so useful species with edible fruit, for example. And in the landscape, there are a lot of earthworks in French Guiana. So for example, here you have a LiDAR image. So here you can see a ditch around a hilltop. And so we were, during my PhD, we were investigating all the things to better understand the human impact on the forests of French Guiana. And we were also interested in some peculiar vegetation types, because the forest is not homogeneous. Sometimes you have bamboo-like patches like here, or you have liana forest, and we were wondering, can we try to infer if they have an anthropogenic origin or not? So first, thanks to the charcoals, we could date human occupations in the forest. So this is one of the, I would say, the most well-known use of charcoals that you can date, if it's not too old, of course. And we were able to show that most sites in French Guiana, they had a bimodal pattern. So the sites were occupied twice. And that's something that we found elsewhere in French Guiana. So here you have a first small peak, and here a bigger one, and in Amazonia too. So let's say here you have a big peak, and here another one. So they are not always exactly synchronous, but they are, most of them, the dates, they span the last 2,000 years. And it's interesting to note that in French Guiana, agriculture with slash and burn dates back to 2,000 years. We don't have evidence older. And in Amazonia, agriculture dates back to 6,000 years. And so I identified charcoal from different sites under different types of vegetation cover. And what I could see is that in many sites, we could see a secondary vegetation, so probably a vegetation opening. So I found pioneers like Cecropia. It's a well-known pioneer in Amazonia, and also heliophilic taxa. So it allowed us to say that the forest was not as dense during human occupation. And then we found also wood that can be seen as useful. So first, wood with good fuel properties. We found also taxa which produce edible fruits, such as this one, Spondias monbin. We found also wood that can be used for construction or crafting, according to the present uses known among Amerindian populations today. But here because in French Guiana, the charcoal record was rather poor compared to what I had in Ethiopia in archaeological sites. Here we interpreted our results as a presence absence. That's why I didn't talk about wood selection, because we couldn't have percentages that were really I mean, there were too few charcoal fragments to talk about percentages, but it was a hint. And especially the mere presence of Spondias monbin, so this edible tree, it's really interesting, because nowadays in French Guiana, this tree, this species, it grows only close to Amerindian villages, because it's planted. It's very rare in the forest, in the mature forest. So it was a proof that there was a human occupation at this place where the charcoals were found. And then what about the bamboo-like vegetation, the patches that we can find in French Guiana in many places? So here we studied two sites. So one without any charcoal or potsherds. And so for this one, we suggested, okay, this is probably natural. Probably this bamboo-like vegetation developed because of edaphic factors. It was also on a steep slope. So probably it developed after a landslide. But for another patch, there was an anthrosol with a lot of charcoal, potsherds. It was enriched in phosphorus, and I could identify 23 different taxa in the richest layer. And that's important because if you imagine a natural fire, the trees would burn where they stand. But the fact that we have a mix of 23 different taxa on the same spot, plus the other characteristics of the site made us think that probably this bamboo-like patch was anthropogenic. It has an anthropogenic origin, and maybe it was a former slash and burn plot because of the enrichment of the soil and of this accumulation of different taxa on the same spot, like in a slash and burn field. What about the liana patches now? So here we had one where there was an earthwork. So here you can see it on this image. It's a ditch on a flat terrain. And so there was an earthwork. There were potsherds in the soil and charcoal. So this place was obviously occupied before. We don't know what it was for because there was no archaeological excavation during my PhD. That's important. It's that we could only rely on archaeobotany, botany, and soil science because there was no archaeological excavation. So it's a bit difficult to interpret the sites. So here we were suggesting, okay, this is probably anthropogenic because of the soil. We have also quite a lot of charcoal taxa in the richest layer, but what is the meaning? It was probably different from the sites that we have supposed to be former slash and burn field because it was not, the characteristics were different, still different. And then we studied another site with earthwork. So this is here, this was a hill surrounded by a ditch. So this time it wasn't the forest cover, no liana, no bamboo-like vegetation. And so there were ceramics, complete ones that you can see on this picture. And there were also a lot of charcoals. And so this site is obviously anthropogenic, but here the forest is still present. So we don't have a liana that developed afterwards or a bamboo-like vegetation. So we thought that because we have different vegetation trajectories in different anthropogenic sites, this is probably because the sites had a different history. So maybe some were former cultivated fields, maybe some were ritual places, maybe some were former habitation sites. We don't know, unfortunately, and the archaeology would help a lot. But already with the charcoal identification, we could propose that all the sites were different. And now I will end with the last example. So in the Caribbean, so Martinique is a small island here in the Lesser Antilles. So the economy of the island during colonial times was based on the sugarcane exploitation and slavery between the 17th and the 19th century, like in many places in the Caribbean, but also in French Guiana, by the way. So here I will talk about lime kiln workers. So you need a lime kiln because you need lime to purify the cane of juice. And so to make work a lime kiln, so you can see it here, you need fuel. And so the lime kiln workers, they were using wood as fuel. And so here we were wondering, okay, how were they managing wood collection, because you have to know that during these times already, during colonial times, the vegetation was already heavily impacted because there was a high sugar production. So there was a strong need of fuel wood. So how did people manage the woodland in these conditions? And so it's important also to note that in Martinique, so this is a map from nowadays. So, and it was more or less the same during colonial times, most probably, or even more degraded. And so today, so the site was Les Anses d'Arlet, it's here. And so the site is in the xerophilic forest, but there is a bit of mesophilic forest also close by. So you have dry forest and more humid forest, let's say. And so here I identified more than 200 charcoal pieces from a lime kiln to really study the wood that was used in the lime kilns. And I could identify 50 different taxa, which is absolutely huge given the number of charcoal pieces. So unlike what we've seen before, it shows that the wood collection was opportunistic. There is no strong wood selection. So some species were more abundant in the charcoal record. We have 14% of Bachelia, which was formerly acacia, and also Loncocarpus, and both are known as a good fuel wood nowadays. But still, I wouldn't talk about a strong wood selection. We could see also that all the taxa found belonged either to the xerophilic or the mesophilic forest, or both. And so it means that the lime kiln workers, they were collecting wood very locally. And this is interesting. And actually, we were not expecting that, because there was interviews in Martinique with the former lime kiln workers, and there are only a few left now. And they were saying that the best wood was the mangrove tree, wood from the mangrove. And we didn't find any in the charcoal record here. And actually, at Les Anses d'Arlet, there is no mangrove. So here is the site, the mangrove is here. And the interview was led at Le Lamentin, where there is mangrove. So it made us conclude that people were taking wood in the environment close by. So it gives insight on the wood collection. And then we found also pioneer taxa and heliophilic taxa in the charcoal record. And so it shows that the vegetation was secondary, and that's what we were expecting, because the vegetation was degraded. So it's in accordance with historical text. And so finally, we found quite a high proportion of small caliber wood, 36%, and also wood from edible trees. And so this made us think that it tells us something about wood management, because so you have to think about an environment that was already heavily degraded, probably that the wood was getting rare. And so we can think that people were rather collecting wood from twigs, small branches, or they were taking them from a pruning waste. And we thought about that because of the edible taxa. We were thinking, why would people cut wood from trees providing guava or breadfruit, which is, by the way, imported from Polynesia? And so we thought, okay, maybe it's pruning waste from these trees. And so people might have chosen this kind of wood management to preserve the mature trees and the useful trees. And so, yeah, this is what anthropology can allow to infer from charcoal identification. So you can have insights into the vegetation dynamics. You can see landscape happening. So by the use of fire. So of course, if you have charcoal, there was fire, but it's also nice to compare with other proxies like phytoliths, for example. We saw that we could see the forest regeneration as well in the charcoal record. You can also suggest when the fire is rather anthropogenic or not. For example, if we think about the volcanic period in Ethiopia, where actually the charcoal were probably produced by man-made fire. we can see the wood selection or not, or if the harvesting of wood is opportunistic. We can see if the supply is local or not, and here it's rather local. And actually, that's, I think, always observed in anthropology, that people harvest the wood close by. And then, thanks to the Martinique case, we could suggest that also people might have tried to harvest the wood in a sustainable way. So I hope I convinced you that charcoal are great and that charcoal identification is really useful. So please, when you excavate in archaeological sites or in non-archaeological sites, think about the charcoal and keep them. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. It was a very interesting talk, and yeah, I'm really convinced. Definitely, I don't know about others, but let's go on to the question and answer session. As a quick reminder to everyone, you can send your questions to the questions that PaleoPerks host, who is Rehmat, and or you could just raise your hand or put your questions directly into the chat. Um, so, yes, our first question is quite an interesting one. Um, okay, we already have a question. Can you say something about phytolith analysis in your three study sites?
Yeah, so thanks for this question. So actually, phytoliths were studied in Ethiopia. We didn't have phytoliths studied in French Guiana nor in Martinique, but in Ethiopia, yeah, it's really interesting because so far I've studied two sites in Ethiopia. So in the first site that I presented today, there were a lot of burnt phytoliths in the same levels that I studied the charcoal. And so every time we could infer anthropogenic fire, the phytoliths were there also showing fire because they were burnt phytoliths. But on the other side that I didn't show here, so there was also a lot of charcoal and anthropogenic fire, but no burnt phytoliths. And this is the big question we have now. It's not answered yet. But on the second side, we are wondering why we don't have as much burnt phytolith. We don't have any even, or fairly. And maybe one of the interpretation we could propose is that maybe there was no opening of the vegetation with fire as in the first site. So maybe it was different, and actually the charcoal taxa from the second site, it's more forest taxa, while in the one that I presented now, we have this ecotone. So yeah, so that's why, yeah, I like when there are several proxies, because it can answer things that we can't answer with only one. So yeah.
Thank you. I think that makes sense. Our next question is from an anonymous question. What are the implications of your work on the myth that Africans are bad environmental managers, causing desertification, etc., and therefore require external intervention?
Yeah. I don't agree with that view, of course, and I think it's I would say it's quite colonial view. You know, it was the same in Amazonia. People were thinking, yeah, people can't live there. It's the conditions are too hard. But we've seen, I mean, I know more about Amazonia because I did my PhD about French Guiana, and I only worked on Ethiopia in Africa. But I think it's the same in every tropical forest, that people, they were very good managers of the vegetation in their environment, and they could deal with it and they could live with it, and in a sustainable way. I mean, we even see now in Amazonia that in places where there were people, the diversity is even stronger, the plant diversity, because they planted trees, they cultivated plots, and so many plants could grow, many different species could grow that wouldn't grow otherwise. And so, yeah, I I think, yeah, that's a myth. It's well said. I wouldn't agree.
As a follow-up to that question, do you see your or this kind of research being picked up by conservation scientists who are trying to make a case for more use of more indigenous knowledge in managing forests?
Sorry, can you repeat the end?
Yeah, like is your work being used by conservation scientists who are trying to make a case for using local knowledge more? Uh, so okay.
Yeah, I think it's really important. Yeah, for example, I know that my colleagues, ethnobotanists and ethnologists, anthropologists, they are very concerned that this knowledge is lost because most of the times it's transmitted orally by speaking. And so, yeah, I think it should be taken into account because, I mean, for thousands of years, people were able to live in a very, very diverse environment without making it poorer, without degrading it. And so, yeah, I think it's something that should be taken into account and very um, seriously, because I'm afraid that there is still a view that I think policymakers sometimes tend to think that they will bring the solution to a country about something, but they speak with the people that live there actually? Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
fair.
more political question, but yeah, I think it's really important.
Yeah. Okay. Next question is also anonymous. Do you see your charcoal records being picked up for global synthesis? Like, what are some limitations in charcoal records that you think are necessary to consider before incorporating them in a global land use history?
Sorry, can you repeat?
Yeah. So, what are the limitations in charcoal records that you think are necessary to consider before incorporating them in a global land use model or something?
Yeah, so
Hmm.
the thing is, um, when you study a charcoal record, it's very important to have a good representation. So you need a lot of charcoal pieces, and then to reconstruct something that makes sense, because you can't reconstruct paleovegetation based only on a few pieces, of course. And the more taxa you can get, the better, because sometimes the let's say the problem I had in French Guiana is that in some sites I had very few charcoal and I couldn't make any interpretation out of it. Or there were some sites, there were a lot of charcoal, but all the same. And probably because we just excavated in a place where there was a big trunk that was burnt or something. And so we found all the time the same. And so, yeah, representativity, actually, it's something that has been studied a lot in the field to make sure that, yeah, because first there is a bias, is that charcoal, it's only woody vegetation. So we don't know about the herbaceous and so. So to be as accurate as possible with charcoal, we have to have a good representativeness. And so several hundred of species of pieces, it's quite nice. Yeah.
Okay, I think that makes sense. Um, the next question: were seeds from fruit trees present in the charcoal obtained in Martinique? If no, seeds were present, does this imply anthropogenic activity?
So yeah, sorry for the formal question. It was on the chat. I could have read it. Sorry.
No, no, no
Um,
problem.
no, there were no seeds. There were only charcoal. So I studied the content of the lime kiln itself. So it was only burnt. Yeah, it was only charcoal from the kiln. I don't know if there were seeds found elsewhere. Maybe it was studied by other part of the project. I'm not sure actually. Uh, yeah, so I can't answer. I'm sorry.
We have another question. Can you say something about? Okay, this is
It was
we
the
have
same.
already, yeah, we already been through this. Sorry about that. So we have another question, which is anonymous. Has your work in the French Guiana inspired archaeological excavations on the site?
Yeah, so I understand the question because it can seem weird that we studied these places without archaeological excavation, but the thing is, it's a bit administrative stuff. So in French Guiana, the archaeologists, they need a permit and it takes time and they are completely overloaded with work. And so they didn't have time to do the excavations. And it was really a pity for me because for the interpretation it would have been, of course, very important. But elsewhere, there are archaeological excavation on other sites with these earthworks, these ditches, and it's still unknown what they mean actually. There is kind of a debate. We don't know if they were ritual places or habitation places or both. Maybe they had different meanings. But yeah, I mean, before my work, of course, there were archaeological excavations, and yeah, it was just very unfortunate they didn't have time to excavate before all the ecologists, paleoecologists, and soil scientists came. Yeah.
So, if I'm understanding it correctly, like uh, permits are given to like separate projects. Like your work is not really about archaeological excavation. Like how what administrative category does your work qualify under?
Yeah, I'm a, I'm a bit everywhere. So
Oh,
in
okay.
So in Martinique, it was a proper archaeological excavation. Charcoal were found, and I joined the project to study the charcoal. In Ethiopia, it was a multidisciplinary project. So there were archaeological excavations some years before, actually, and all the archaeobotanical remains were kept, and so we could study them afterwards. In French Guiana, it was different because it was also a multidisciplinary project, and but archaeologists didn't have had the time to work before us. So again, administrative issues. But so I work both on archaeological sites and also I would say anthropogenic sites because people were there. But when there is no archaeological excavation, you can't say it's an archaeological site. But I also studied charcoal from a natural environment. For example, lately there was a paper published in PNAS by Pierre-Olivier Antoine. He's a paleontologist, and so in French Guiana there is this rocket launch center for Ariane. I don't know if you see. It's from the European Space Agency, and so they were making construction work to build the new rocket launcher, and they found many fossils. So they called the paleontologists. The paleontologists took the fossils, and so they found charcoal. And so here I could study a bit of charcoal. There was not a lot, but I found mangrove trees, for example. So in the charcoal record, there were just a few pieces actually, but with taxa very interesting because they were indicators of mangrove, and there were also specialists of pollens, phytoliths, and they also found a mangrove area, and also we had also um, hints about a savanna close by. And with all these proxies, from the botanical point of view, we could reconstruct the paleo environment. So I can also work on sites that where there is no archaeological excavations in other contexts. Yeah.
That's very interesting. Thank you for sharing. I think this will be a final question. What are your methods for studying charcoal? Do you use spores for identification at all?
Uh, my next project, yeah. So actually,
Okay.
I have to say I'm on the job market. My postdoc is over now, unfortunately. Actually, I would like to work again on French Guiana because I have a lot of contacts there. I have colleagues and there are a lot of things to do. And also on the Caribbean because I know that I mean, with anthropology, with charcoal identification, it's always the same. There is a lot of material, but not a lot of specialists. And yeah, I would be very interested to work on the Caribbean as well. But I know who Aliénor is. Hi, Aliénor, and she knows, and I'm passionated. Does that exist in English about paleontology and dinosaurs? And we met on a paleontological site, and I would be also happy to work on non-archaeological stuff, but older stuff and reconstruct woody vegetation when dinosaurs or other extincted species rule the earth. It would be great. I don't
I
know if I
think,
answered everything.
yeah, Eleanor has also asked a question. Okay, so that was what are your next projects and
Yeah.
what, yeah. All right. So I think you went over this. Um, so, yeah, I think that brings us to the end of our question answers session. And I will quickly take over the screen share. Um, So I would like to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you, Stephanie, for giving such an exciting talk and answering all our questions. Please fill out the weekly feedback form. The link has been shared on the chat. Uh, we would like to know more about how was your experience. Join us next week on October 22nd. On the topic using paleo-environmental techniques to evaluate the role of sewage management and legacy pollution on algal blooms in standing waters, a case study at Rutland Water Nature Reserve by Savannah Warren from the Loughborough University in United Kingdom. So see you next week, and thank you, Stephanie, again. This was a great talk.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone for joining, and thank you to the Paleo Perks committee. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.